following is tape number 1 of the notes for the Judy Garland autobiography. Would you like to say something to the people?
Hi.
To begin with, let's begin at the beginning. Where were you born?
I was born in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, June 10th, 1922. It's a very small town on the Iron Range in Minnesota.
That's all we need. We're all through. How many years did you live in Minnesota?
I went on a stage the first time at the age of 2, and so actually the first 2 years of my life, because after my initial debut on the stage at the age of 2, my father sold the theater that he owned in Grand Rapids, and we all got into a car and headed for Hollywood.
Were you that bad that he had to sell the theater and move out of town, or were you that good that he wanted to go to Hollywood?
I don't know. He never told me one way or the other. Nobody else did in my family either.
In other words, you lived in Grand Rapids only until you were a little over 2 years old.
Yes, that's right.
Do you remember anything from your parents' or sisters' conversations regarding the house you lived in Grand Rapids?
Well, I don't remember, except I do recall certain things, as one is inclined to do. I didn't go back to see the town of Grand Rapids again until I was in the movies. I think I was about 15 years old, and they declared an official Judy Garland Day in the town I was born. I'm sure this is a very usual reaction. I had always known that the house in Grand Rapids was a white house on the corner, and it seemed to me until I saw it when I was 15 that it was an enormous house, and it had a garden in the back that my 2 sisters, strangely enough, they were not as terrified of bees. And in the summertime, when the roses would bloom, they'd go out and catch great hornets and things, and bottle, I think mostly, to come into a room with me when my back was turned and let the bees out, so I'd go rushing around in great terror. But the house actually was very pretty, as I recall. I don't remember what the interior looked like. I remember the garden. I remember the way it snowed. And going outside when my mother and father would go down to his theater. My mother played the piano in the pit because there were silent movies that he ran in his theater, and she underscored by playing in the pit. So when they would go to work, my 2 sisters would be stuck babysitting with me, and when in the snow, I can remember rushing out and making angels, which meant it didn't take a great deal of that wasn't what went into the making of this living legend. All you had to do was lie down flat in the snow and rush your arms back and forth, and then stand up rather daintily and look at the impression you'd made, and it looked like an angel. That's I remember that, and I remember the kitchen was a rather good-sized kitchen. My mother being a very good cook, and it had a lot of, oh my goodness, how do I remember? A lot of Johnson's powdered malted milk always, because my sisters were always trying to more or less get me to go to sleep, by giving me tons of this powdered malted milk in hot milk, and I just, the more they'd feed me, the more awake I'd become, so they didn't know. All I know is it was quite, there were that, and I remember that when one of my sisters had a pet canary, I guess it was, and she had a pet canary, or she had found an injured, wounded little bird and brought it home, and much making of splints for this thing, and the bird kicked off, and there was such a burial service. You've never known the likes of it. And I was even allowed in on that, and we got a cigar box from my father's den, whereupon I immediately smoked one of the cigars. I did.
At what age was this?
2.
2?
Yes.
2. Did you enjoy it?
Not particularly, but I finished it and fainted, dead away.
Before the burial service or afterwards?
Well, no, had absolutely nothing to do, actually, with the burial. Just finding the cigar box reminds me that when we found it, there were 2 extra cigars. My father didn't smoke cigars, but he always had them there, and there were 2 left, and I took one and smoked it while my sister, who was going into great Sarah Bernhardt emotions about this idiot bird, was lining the cigar box with much tinfoil and sort of satin. And I was smoking this cigar and getting sicker and sicker, but I seemed to want to make some kind of impression. And when then it was time for the burial service, and we got a couple of kids from the neighborhood. My sisters got 2 or 3 children from the neighborhood, and we had a long procession into the garden, and we buried the bird, and it was a little tombstone affair that my sister had made. And then that was about maybe 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 other friends of my sister's showed up, so they dug the grave up, and we had to go through the whole thing again. They dug up so that the other 2 cats could be in on the services.
You mentioned the garden. Was the garden behind the house or in front? Or describe the yard as well as you remember it.
It was the house was a white board house, 2-story house, and it had a porch all around it. The front yard was raised up simply because of the swell of ground that it was on. So the front yard was just grass, and the side was grass, and then the back, from going through the kitchen out the back door, the kitchen door, you went into the garden.
Was there a yard on both sides and in the front also?
There was a lawn clear across the front of the house. I don't remember how much space. I remember my grandmother's house, how much space there was, but in our own house in Grand Rapids, I just remember that being on a corner, the lawn went across the front of our house and around the corner, and then you see it was just, then if you turned right again, it became the rose garden. The house was in the middle of that. There must have been some kind of either lawn or something next door. I never did get to know the people next door. That's why it's funny. I've always been called the girl next door, because I never knew a girl next door.
Did you and your sisters all have separate rooms, or did you all stay in the same room?
My 2 sisters shared the same room, and I was always sort of put out into some room that they could manage to fine. Sometimes I slept with my father, sometimes I slept with my mother, sometimes I slept in an extra bedroom that was upstairs by myself.
How would you describe the house? Comfortable, homey, pleasant, or what?
All of those things. I think really that it was the most beautiful house that I've ever known, because those 2 years, although I was too frightened to speak before I sang, I was very aware of a peacefulness because of the very beauty of the little town itself. It's a magnificent looking town. The house was everything that represents family. Clean, old-fashioned, beautiful, not frightening, and gay, good house.
During these first 2 years, how do you remember your family getting along with each other?
Well, I remember that that was the last time, the first 2 years of my life, as I recall, the only time I saw my mother and father happily married. It was when we got to California that they became unhappy. But they were not unhappy first 2 years of my life, because they would sometimes they'd go out and do a play, like they have summer stock now, you know.
Mm-hmm.
They'd go out and act in a play together now and then, and they had many friends, and they were very much in love. They were very close, and the only thing is that I think I caused or at least there was a great deal of time taken to convince me that from the time my mother found out she was going to have this unplanned third baby, that was sort of the beginning of the downfall of because I was not scheduled. I really was not wanted. My mother didn't want to have any more children.
Did she make any attempts to not have you after she found out that she was pregnant? You mentioned various times that, you know, she was jumping up and down off chairs and that sort of thing.
Yeah. She always from the day I was born, I think, till until the last time I saw her, she always took great delight in telling rooms full of people at her house, whichever house she would be in at the time, how difficult it was for her, because she did everything to get rid of me. She must have rolled down 19,000 flights of stairs, jumped off of tables, and for some reason I was a very stubborn child and was not about to be shaken loose. So then she had to, when she found that out, and it became too cumbersome for her to roll down any more stairs. Was it when she was 8.5 months pregnant? It got a bit roly-poly. So she more or less became resolved, because she knew that she was going to have a little boy. Having had 2 daughters, she thought, well, it's the only way she could possibly accept this ghastly thing that had happened was that she have a son. And when I turned out to be just another girl, after they had already named me Frank, that was my father's name, it didn't work out too well for anybody.
What was your mother's name?
Ethel.
Her last name?
Her maiden name actually was well, let's see. Her mother was Fitzgerald, but then my grandmother got divorced and married a man named Milne, Milne. So her name was Ethel Milne.
Could you describe your mother's background?
My mother's background? I don't think I can. I can't explain what in the hell kind of background could could produce this hideous woman, this outrageous, awful woman. I don't know what kind of background. She certainly wasn't of the Dickens era, and that's the only reason. There's nothing very colorful. It's just that she was black Irish, rather pretty, not much, just about my height, just a little under 5 feet, and dark eyes. I don't know. Her father, my grandfather, was an engineer, train in Duluth, and of course my mother hated my grandmother. Decided, evidently my grandmother, whose name was Eva, had something like 7 children, and my grandfather was an absolute terror, I guess, and frightened everyone to death in my mother's family until my mother turned and hit him when she was, because he would get stoned, and then there was a great enormous hill, and he would get so drunk driving this train, I must say it was great, that he would just get to the top of the hill and open up the whistle, and everybody knew that there might be a stunning crash which would wipe out, first of all, his wife and children. And he would race down, with the whistle, and everybody just, obviously, he threatened every day, to kill them all, and my grandmother went straight about it. And my mother, I think at the ripe age of 4, punched him in the nose with a full pitcher, a tin pitcher of water, because he was drunk. She didn't pour it on his head. She poured it over his head, the water first, and then hit him right smack in the face. So she didn't have any trouble with him anymore, proving that she overcame that by being very brutal, and then she went ahead with that same behavior pattern when she raised her own kids, one of them being me.
You mentioned she was reasonably pretty. Did she have dark hair, and what color were her eyes, etc.?
I think I just said she had dark brown eyes, dark hair, and just not terribly pretty. I don't look like. No, she didn't. She was plump, very plump. And very bad legs. And because no one, I didn't look like anybody in my family. I don't know why I wound up having the features in my face that I have, because no one else had that.
Could you describe your father?
My father was terribly, terribly handsome man when my mother first met him. He was so handsome, it was incredible. He was so slender. I would say not terribly tall. He was about 5'11". Slender, sensitive face. He was French. and a little Irish. He was at a magnificent a shock of beautiful dark hair when he was a young man. I've seen pictures in the family album that disappeared somewhere, but he was awfully attractive, and he was engaged to the woman who was, before he met my mother, he was engaged to the woman who finally wound up marrying the comedian actor Joey Brown. And then when he met my mother, he broke his engagement to her and then married my mother and settled down. When they were going to have children, had been in vaudeville singing team. He sang, she played piano. And then he bought a theater when he realized that they were going to have a family. And he became rather paunchy, but still very attractive. Marvelous, loud laugh. Funny, explosive temper. What are you doing?
I'm looking at the thing.
Well, don't poke me in the face.
Sorry. Talk a little bit into it.
What do you mean, talk a little bit? What do you... What?
It's all right. I just wanted to see if the thing was recording correctly.
Well, maybe we should have found out a little while before I went through all of this. This stunning detail. As a matter of fact, thinking about what I've just spoken, I don't think I have any reason to write a book at all. I think I have the dumbest...
That's just the first 2 years, and there's a lot more to say about that even. Now, hang on a second while we
Okie
check out
dokie.
the tape record.
I will not go into this thing about Jingle Bells. I just won't.
You won't have to. Everybody knows about it already,
I know.
including the writer of Jingle Bells.
It wasn't even Christmas time.
And that's what makes it
It was
all
in
the better.
June.
You mentioned that your parents were in vaudeville before your father bought the theater. Could you expound just a little bit on that?
Well, my mother was had a job playing in the pit for people who would take the job that my father did. Singers would come out in front of movie screens where they showed just slides, more or less, and sing, you know, and she would accompany them. And then they met, and they decided to go on the stage, and they wheeled a piano on the stage for my mother.
Where was this that they met?
They met in Duluth. That's where my mother was born. And they met in Duluth, and suddenly decided that his name was Frank Avent, and she was Ethel Marion, I think it was. Not Ethel Marion. Yeah. Gee, I didn't know. I think I was always afraid to ask her if she had a middle name. At any rate, they decided to have an act and get into vaudeville, and they changed their names to, this is after they were married, Jack and Virginia Lee, sweet Southern singers. No, the sweet Southern singers, yes. Now, he did come from Tennessee, but after all, this was in Duluth, and his name was Gum.
What was he doing when he met your mother? Was he one of the singers that appeared before the screen?
Yes, yes.
And when they formed their vaudeville act of Jack and Virginia Lee, where did they go with it?
Well, sort of just around that section of the country, you know, sort of Wisconsin, and just into small places where they booked themselves, the booker of the theater.
How did they wind up in Grand Rapids eventually?
That was when they discovered that my mother was going to have a baby, and my father decided to go into a very good and sensible business. So he bought the only theater in the town of Grand Rapids, Minnesota.
What was the name of the theater, do you remember?
The Rialto Theater.
Did it show movies and have vaudeville acts or what?
No, it just showed movies. The only time it had vaudeville acts, a vaudeville act, was when my two sisters became the sort of town darlings, and they came out and did a sister act, a duet.
Do you remember what they did?
Where? You mean?
On the stage, what did they do? Sing and dance, or play hopscotch, or what?
No, one doesn't play hopscotch on the stage. Don't be silly. No, they sang. They sang harmony. They were constantly, as I recall, singing in a little Spanish town. I don't know why, because it was in Minnesota.
And did your parents give up their vaudeville act when they bought the theater and just concentrate on running the theater and the films, or did they every now and then do their little act on stage?
Oh, every now and then they'd go out and, as I say, do a play or something, only for a week or something. And then, of course, when we all, when I got into the act, they decided, my father and mother, for some unknown reason, I don't know why, he sold the theater, and we all traveled west, and we traveled, they were still Jack and Virginia Lee, and we were the Gum Sisters.
Well, before we leave Grand Rapids, let's talk about your sisters for a couple of minutes. What were their names, and how much older than you were they?
Well, my oldest sister's name was Mary Jane, and she was 7 years older than I, and the middle girl, whose name was Dorothy Virginia, was 5 years older than I. And along came Frances Ethel.
Didn't they, one of them, change her name at one time?
That isn't me barking, by the way. Yes, after George Jessel, many years later, changed our last name to Garland, my oldest sister suddenly decided she hated Mary Jane, and she got awfully classy and chose the name Suzanne. So I'd always been called, well, then I awful hang-up, because I was called Babe or Baby Gum. Now that's a rough rap. So I decided that if she could change her name suddenly to Suzanne, that I could change mine, and I liked the song that was very popular at that time called Judy. So I chose to change mine simply so no one would call me Baby anymore. And I just wouldn't answer them if they called me Babe or Baby.
You've mentioned at times that you never spoke until the time you sang Jingle Bells on stage in your father's theater. Could you elaborate a little on that and how you finally did manage to get on stage and sing?
Well, I suffered awful ear infections, one after the other, from the day I was born, and in those days they just didn't have any kind of medicine or what they call miracle cure. So they would simply take me to the hospital or the doctor's office, and I'd be strapped to a table and have my ears lanced, and then I'd be smacked on the couch of my house, being brought home the same day, and with a pair of my father's socks full of hot salt. draped over both ears. I was very much like a cocker spaniel. So I couldn't hear much of anything, and also I didn't have an awful lot to say because nobody said anything to me. Nobody. I was silent until my grandmother put me on stage.
Tape number 2, Judy Garland autobiography.
Sort of present day. That's all right.
I really am.
Oh, we might as well get off on a good
get the whole thing
start.
going here. I mean, that really is a good way to begin. Nothing like being direct.
Howdy. That's so funny.
Now that we uncovered that. Why do you want to write a book? I don't. All right.
I haven't the faintest idea, except that I've been told for years that I should, that I have this extraordinary story to tell, and I don't know whether I suppose it is an extraordinary story, but when one is telling it about themselves, it's a bit dull sometimes. I don't know why I want to write a book, probably just to make money.
No, there's more to it than that, I think. There's the fact that not only is there an extraordinary story to tell, but there's your opinions about everything that's happened and everything that will happen in the future. And that's what makes it more valuable from your point of view.
Yeah, tell me more about yourself so I can write this book. Actually, you are right. I think I'd like to write a book, if it's possible, for you to make me sort of go straight. The fact is that I just have lost too many years and time and everything through singing, and I like to talk and tell the truth and the funny side of things. I'm not the daughter of tragedy. That wasn't her name. Her name was Ethel. I'd like to expose a lot of people who've been, who deserve it. And I'd like to just let anyone who would care to read these words of mine know what it's like to have to the hell with saying how hard it is to be around me and how difficult, because that's why everyone has left me inevitably in all my life. I'm just too difficult to be, but I've had to be with me. So I'd like to write about what it's like to be with me. I've managed to put up with me. I'd like to talk about all the people who haven't been able to manage it. And I'd also like a few questions answered.
What sort of questions would you like answered?
Questions that I'm sure I'll find my own answer to by talking about things that I've buried within myself too long.
How do you feel in general, overall, about your life and career?
Well, now, there are two separate things, you see.
Well, let's take your life.
Well, my life has been my career. My career has been my life. But I unfortunately have, or fortunately I should say, actually, have been able to separate the two. There is a woman who is just a woman, bright, I think, rather funny, as I'm told. I hope to Christ this comes out funny. Otherwise it's going to really it's going to make Tchaikovsky sound like the Beatles. if I'm not funny. But I seem to make people laugh, mostly when I fail. However, I don't. What was the question again, sir? What was the question?
I asked you how you...
Of the life. You mean the career, the working?
No. What's your overall general feeling about your life and career? Because you said they were inseparable, although you've managed to keep them separated somewhat. When you think back upon the last 44 years, what is the first thought that comes to your mind? How do you feel about it?
I was robbed.
Go on.
I was robbed. I was robbed.
Of what?
Of love, of understanding, of decency, of kindness, of money, of self-respect, which I've managed to hang on to somehow. Otherwise, I wouldn't be alive to talk to you now. But it's been the Brinks robbery was just a swishing bank robbery compared to the hideous robbery in my life and career.
Who robbed you of these things?
Everybody. Not everybody. Everybody except my 3 children. They robbed me emotionally, they misused me, and frightened me. And I think I really have a great love and devotion for retarded children because I'm a rather retarded adult. At the age of 44, to finally get over fears that I should have been able to get over had I not been a public commodity at the age of 2, then a sort of paying off slot machine everlastingly jackpot thing from the age of 13 at MGM.
Well, I think your ability to deal with it makes you a rather exceptional adult rather than being a retarded one, don't you?
I don't know that yet. I think maybe I don't really know that. I think it's the only thing exceptional about me is that I'm still walking around and not having been driven up the wall a long time ago by people who are in the wall business. The wall in Berlin is nothing compared to the one they've been trying to drive me up. Agents, lawyers, husbands, friends, blackmailers, and so forth. I've had a cast of thousands. Cecil B. DeMille never knew what a really big, wasn't he the fellow? And D.W. Griffith, he was a good American fellow. I don't know. I have a lot of opinions. As a matter of fact, you must get used to the fact, and I think it should be written straight away. I don't talk well. I don't finish any of my words lots of times because my mind goes faster, and I stammer a lot. But I've managed to stammer along pretty well and leave the robbers rather flopping around in the La Brea tar pits.
Do you attribute this lifelong robbery primarily to a whole group of individuals, one after the other, or would you classify it all under the problem of being robbed by fame?
Well, I wasn't always famous. Mind you, on June 10th, 1922, I wasn't famous at all when I was born. I was infamous.
But you said earlier the first couple of years of your life were moderately normal and pleasant with your family.
Bullshit. Not for me. For them it was. I could look at them and see them behaving rather pleasantly. They were never pleasant to me. I really was not wanted.
That's why you never talked, right?
Yeah. When you're not wanted, you feel like you haven't been born, and your mother pretends you haven't been born. So why talk or get a child who's not wanted to talk. What reason? I didn't have any reason for being.
How were you treated specifically by all the members of your family as a child?
As a child, a misfit.
Did they pay attention to you or take care of you or ignore you and make fun of you or what?
They didn't take the time to do any of those things. I think they just, my mother saw to it somehow that I got some kind of food now and then, and that was about it. I was not anything. I was an enigma. I wasn't there to them. So how could they ignore me if I wasn't there? You don't ignore something that isn't there.
Did your sisters seem to resent the fact that you had been born?
No, they realized that I wasn't there either. How could I be there? You know, I couldn't. They were so busy being a big hit, ho-hum hit. They were rather mean. My whole family was. They were always mean.
Or did they just ignore you, or did they intentionally do mean things to you?
Yes, they intentionally did mean things to me.
What?
They tormented me, my two sisters.
How?
They found the things that I was most frightened of are that my nerves center couldn't bear and would constantly physically and mentally torment me with it.
What sort of things do they do?
Well, for instance, my throat is a funny place because it's very sensitive. I don't know whether that's from outwardly of the outside of my throat. In other words, my neck is very sensitive, especially near my where my vocal cords are inside. They found that I couldn't bear having that done, and they would lock me in the crib, put the doors, 4 slats up, you know.
Tickling your neck, you mean, right?
Yes, yes. Not tickling it, strangling. To the point where I just go into wild hysterics and finally foam at the mouth and faint.
While you were in the crib?
Yes, while I was in the crib.
That's good.
I came from really a rough bunch. It's been a rough life.
How did your father treat you?
My father, I didn't learn until several years ago. Only once was he allowed, when my mother's back was turned. He sort of picked me up in his arms when I was a little baby, and he walked up and down the room. I evidently was crying, and nobody cared to hear my crying. He picked me up, and then my mother bawled the hell out of him, and he put me down again. That's the only contact I've ever had.
How did you find that out?
I had to ask my sister, Virginia.
What was your family's relationship and your relationship with your grandmother, the one who subsequently put you on the stage?
My grandmother and my mother were always fighting Irish, you know. And my grandmother, as a matter of fact, was a desperately frustrated and unhappy woman who sort of got back at my mother by taking this mute child and putting her on the same stage with the other two sisters because she was simply fighting with my mother.
In other words, she put you on the stage to sing Jingle Bells just to make your parents mad, right? How did she go about it?
Well, I used to be taken when my sisters would be working on the stage. My mother would be playing in the pit. My father was running the theater. my grandmother would take care of me. I'd have to sit on her lap. And she got very angry at my mother and decided to disgrace my mother by putting this mute child on stage.
Thinking you do nothing at all once you get up there except stand there like an idiot, right?
That's right. So she made a dress for me, my grandmother, a white dress. I went and I was sitting on her lap and watching my two sisters sing in a little Spanish town.
Again?
I think that's, yes.
Is that the only song they knew?
I think that and Old Fashioned Garden I can't quite remember. And we were in the audience while I was sitting on my grandmother's lap. She simply put me on, and nobody realized that I had lived through a couple of Christmases and heard a song called Jingle Bells. I simply felt a spotlight hit me, and I was terrified, and I made the first sound I ever made by singing Jingle Bells. But the only trouble was that I was so glad to be allowed to make any sound at all that I sang 17 choruses.
17?
17. And my father was standing in the wings. He was amazed. He didn't know what was going to happen either. Finally came up and picked me up and took me off.
A number of other stories about you and your program and that sort of thing say that you sang 8 choruses, but it was actually 17, right?
I was 17. The people who say it was 8 choruses are probably like Harry Warner, who cut A Star Is Born.
What was his name again, Mr. Warner?
Horseshit Harry.
Horseshit Harry.
Cut The Star Is Born with his gums.
How did you get off the stage once you were out there singing Jingle
Well, I
Bells?
know we're going to keep this up to date now, but
We get back there.
no, we're not in this tape because we're.
All right, let me ask you one question about it first, though.
Yeah.
You said that your first reaction when the spotlight hit you was that you were glad to be able to make some kind of sound, that you were terrified, but that you were happy to be able to be allowed to make some kind of sound.
I don't know whether I was happy or not. I think it was actually a matter of shock.
How come you kept on singing?
Well, one does that in a state of shock, a child even. I hadn't talked. No one had listened. No one had done anything but torment me. I opened my mouth and a sound came. I was left alone. Maybe I was in those 17 choruses making up for the silence I'd maintained.
For 2 years.
Yes, well, lots of children don't talk immediately, but if I had have been born of different parents, the minute I was spawned, I'd have said, I object to you as much as you do to me.
Did you want to bring this back up to the present now?
Yeah.
Taking what you just said about your feeling in the spotlight and being on stage for the first time, how do you compare that with your subsequent feelings as to being in the spotlight? As you were a child in vaudeville, as you grew into it, as you became a star, a concert entertainer, how do you feel now about being in the spotlight, entertaining in front of audiences?
I think it's all right. I think it's fine. I love audiences. I just think that too many people get between the entertainer and the audience. I think the audience is being robbed of being entertained because there are too many businessmen. There's Madison Avenue is 8,000 miles wide. It's just charcoal blue suede nonsense. And there are too many people who are too many buffers for a so-called entertainer. Therefore, the audience doesn't get the value of the talent that a person may have in taking their troubles off their hearts and their worries out of them. Because, you see, it's a very strange and I think very objectionable time of the great stars of today actually are the agents. They used to be bookers. Before that, they were flesh peddlers, and it all comes out. They can't entertain themselves. They can't get into a spotlight themselves, so they get as close to it as they can, and then I really feel their actual anger at not being able to be a Judy Garland, which is kind of strange because I've always had to deal with men, businessmen who have become Judy Garland. Even Freddie Mustache.
Freddie Fields?
Freddie Fields. Or Shep Fields, or any of those Fields boys. Oh, and then, of course, there's GAC, MCA, CMA. Oh, FUCK. That's right. And British and American distributors that I would really like to have someday, which just means bad. You could put out bad literature, bad songs, bad food. I think it's a rough time, and I don't think anybody should ever, anymore, be talked out of not be talked into a position and surrounded because they are talented. It doesn't make a difference whether you're nice or not. That's not taken into consideration. A commodity is not supposed to communicate. A commodity actually is sort of like a machine. And I think the lack of communication is what I resent most. And they have robbed me of that. That's one of the great things.
What do you mean by the lack of communication?
Because they made sure that no one but the people that they hand chose came around me.
In other words, so they could control you, right?
Exactly. That's right. That's why I've spent so many years, so many nights, days, years of loneliness. That's why I am shy and afraid. I've been cut off.
Why did you let them do it?
I had no control over it. I didn't know what was going on when I was 13.
The reason I asked you earlier about your general feelings about your life and career, separately or together, was so we could get a general picture of how you felt about the whole thing, which I think would be a good way to begin a book about your life. And you did mention that you were robbed by all of these people, by everyone. I mean
emotionally, too. By my mother, father, sisters. Because of my talent.
Do you include the audience in this?
No. The audience has been my only friend. The audiences have been. The audience made it possible for me to talk, sing, and be alive. Because they have approved of me. People singularly who I've paid to work for me, to be my friend, and they've don't approve. I don't know why. I don't know much of anything. I think I've explained before. It isn't terribly easy to come up with an answer and to dwell too long upon the why. Why did the agents do this? Why did MGM behave the way they did? Why have the newspapers printed such idiotic and messy stories. Why was I not allowed to talk? Why was I overworked? Why was I... Well, you could dwell on... You'll never get an answer, but maybe we'll find one.
Hopefully.
Oh, I think so.
I think so.
I think I know why. I just don't think anybody's ever taken the time to listen.
Why?
Why? Which one? Which part?
Whichever one you want.
Well, I'm going to just say that I know that there's no... I know the answer. There's no... Unfortunately, I wish I were a Sandra Doo-da-doo singer who didn't have a brain in her head. Sometimes I wish that. I'm sure that everyone who's made an extraordinarily amount of good money off of me, so that their wives are much better dressed than I am. Their children are much better cared for. There is money in the bank. I think that the answer, why, if I say why, I'm not being absolutely true, because I know why. It was commercial.
You mean they did it for the money?
Those who didn't do it for the money did it to get power, for their ego.
All of which left you alone with actually no personal contacts that you could trust. Friends, husbands, anything, right?
I've never had anyone to whom I could turn to talk to. I've never had a friend that I could confide in. The only one I did have was a girl that MGM assigned, and I thought she was my friend for 8 years. Turned out that she was working for Louis B. Mayer and Eddie Mannix, and she was reporting every minute of my day and getting paid for it.
What was her name?
Her name was Betty Asher.
Did she work as your secretary, or in what capacity?
No, she was a part of the publicity department at MGM.
Was she assigned solely to you?
She was assigned solely to me, because MGM wanted to always have me under their thumb and have this, I think it was rather obscene of them.
In other words, they set you up. They made her a friend of yours, supposedly, as far as you knew, and she was actually working for them, right?
That's right. That's right.
How did this all take place?
Well, I'd been at Metro for a long time, and I didn't have anybody to talk to. I never have had, mind you, it's always been a rather transient life, traveling in vaudeville. You work a week, and you make friends during that week of work in vaudeville, and then everybody goes to a different town. I didn't have anyone to talk to in my family, and when I went to Metro, for a long time I didn't have anyone, and then suddenly this girl was chosen by all of the executives, the top men at MGM, to take over and more or less represent Judy Garland, I being the top star at MGM, and I found her a very nice, funny woman, girl, approximately my same age, a little older, but at least she had humor. And she moved into the apartment next to mine, and we became best friends, and I thought, oh, at last there's somebody I can confide in, and I did for 8 years, and then Louis Mayer threw the book at me, and it was all there, 8 years.
What kind of a person did Betty Asher appear to be in the beginning to you?
A very amusing, smart, imaginative, warm-hearted friend. She was indeed not any of those things.
Could you describe her physically?
Yes, she was short, she was red-haired, she was not very pretty. She was the daughter of a man called Eve Asher, who was produced pictures at Universal.
How do you spell Eve?
EPH. He produced Frankenstein.
I think you produced a female Frankenstein, too, from your description of her.
And her brother, Billy Asher, is very nice, I guess. But he's managed. I didn't get mixed up with him, but she really was a disaster. She looked like a disaster, too.
Your friendship lasted for 8 years?
Yes.
Before you found out that she was really working against you and not for you?
She was a traitor. She was an acid. I think under different circumstances that maybe she could have been if she hadn't been so fiendish, and then maybe in another line of business, maybe she would have been an acquaintance that might have been amusing, but this way she was assigned a job that she wanted, and I didn't have a clue. It was all planned very well, but when I found out 8 years later, I haven't had a confidant since, because I don't know the meaning of it.
In other words, you really trusted this woman and told her all of your personal feelings, and she turned right around and told them all to Louis B. Mayer.
She told them to Eddie Mannix, Louis B. Mayer, Benny Thor, Arthur Freed, Sam Katz. It was all put into a great big file every day. What I ate, who I went out with, what time I got home, what I said, what I did, what I wore.
You must have lived very closely with this person, is that right?
She had the apartment next door to mine. Turned out later that she was sort of mixed up lesbian, but not. She was sleeping with Eddie Mannix during this phase.
How do you know that?
Because it's in his will, and she told me. She confided in me too, kid, but I didn't keep a file on her, unfortunately.